All right, so this is really exciting. We're moving on to talking about the government. So far, we've treated the government as this unknown thing that makes decisions on its own. This series of videos, we're going to dig deeper to figure out how does the government really operate. And in today's world, with all the governments facing tighter budgets, whether it's the United States or Oman, it is important for us to know how do we define the government's problem. So each government faces a difficult problem. It needs to provide services to its residents, but to provide those services, they need to generate revenue to cover those costs. So every government is going to have outlays or things that they're spending on, and therefore they're also going to need to generate revenue. And most of the time they generate revenue through taxation. So the goal of this chapter is to get a better understanding of the government spending and government revenue. We will explain what we mean by government outlays, what we mean by government revenue, and if we're talking about revenue, we need to talk about the different types of tax systems that exist around the world. We're also going to talk about something that is really important in the context of the United States, and that's a common mistake that is often made. That mistake is the difference between marginal tax rates versus average tax rates. All of you have to pay taxes in the United States, so let's talk about what the difference is. Because policymakers, politicians, always run on this idea of reducing tax rates, but it's never really clear if they're talking about average tax rates or marginal tax rates. And I want you to be informed citizens. First, let's start discussing what we mean by government outlays. In this video, we will discuss government outlays or spending in the United States. Spending in the US can be broken down into three main categories: mandatory outlays, discretionary spending, and interest payments. Mandatory outlays are spending because an existing law mandates that the government fund these programs. It is very difficult to adjust these mandatory outlays. Some mandatory outlays are called entitlement programs because citizens who meet certain requirements are entitled to these benefits. And therefore, this becomes really important for us to think about what it is when we're thinking about what government can adjust and the government problem. So entitled or mandatory outlays are available to citizens, and we can't get away from these payments. Social Security and Medicare fall into mandatory outlays. On the other hand, you have discretionary outlays. Discretionary outlays are things that are subject to adjustment during the annual budget process. Examples of these are things that usually get cut pretty quickly: payments to government workers, defense spending, spending on infrastructure like bridges and roads, education. These are what we consider discretionary outlays. And this is really where you see a lot of flexibility in what's going on to get cut or where increases usually happen pretty quickly. The majority of the United States spending is actually in the form of mandatory outlays. 2/3 of our budget is allocated to mandatory outlays. 41% of that budget is allocated to Social Security and Medicare. %30 of the budget is allocated to discretionary spending, with defense spending accounting for 15% of the overall spending. And then roughly 7% of the US spending goes to paying interest on debt that the US has accrued. In some parts of the world, like Oman, for instance, right now interest payments are becoming a larger portion of the budget. And if your interest payments become too high, then it takes away from other discretionary outlays. Governments cannot invest in infrastructure, they cannot invest in education, and if interest payments get too large, then it might take away from mandatory outlays, which leads to a reduction in the quality of life and living standards. That's why it's important for us to know where the government is spending, the rate in which it's spending, and the fraction of your mandatory outlays. Your mandatory outlays can change from year to year. They are easily influenced by demographics. For instance, if population is aging, that would increase Social Security and entitlement programs. As the population ages, they enter retirement age, your mandatory outlays increase. So it's important for us to consider demographics as well when we're looking at government budgets and forecasting future spending. Here we have a graph of the United States government outlays or spending from 1970 to 2020. And what we see is government outlays increase throughout time. However, most of our growth in government outlays really came after 1980, and then exponentially grew after 2000 when the government started spending more on defense spending. We see an increase in spending around 2001, then again during the Great Recession, and recently between 2019 and 2020. So that's a quick overview of our government spending. In the United States, government spending is broken down into 3 categories: mandatory outlays, discretionary outlays, and interest payments. So if you have any questions about how the government spends, please reach out, work through the problems. It will help you understand where we're allocating our funding and some of the definitions that we've discussed. Thank you.